Hello, and welcome to this wonderfully exciting and riveting presentation on peasants in the 18th century. Now, of course you're thinking, wait, aren't all peasants the same? They lived the same cruddy lives. They were poor. You know, they all lived the same terrible peasant lives. Well, dear watcher, this is where you are incorrect. We're relatively cruddy by today's standards, but depending on where you lived, it was bad for different reasons. Or worse, depending on location. Peasants made up most of the population and were divided into lower-class farmers and laborers in Western Europe and heavily oppressed serfs in Eastern Europe. The importation of New World silver led to an increase in inflation. This inflation, combined with falling temperatures and lowered food production, led to the price revolution, the price of grain, and caused widespread hardship and greater incentive to Eastern European landowners to increase the practice of serfdom in Eastern Europe, a practice that was long dead in Western Europe. We're planning on following two different peasants, Adam, a hypothetical man from the not-so-hypothetical country of Great Britain, and Tito, an absurdly hypothetical man from the not-so-hypothetical country of Russia.
Life in Russia wasn't the best. In fact, it was possibly the worst it was in all of Europe. Here we're going to follow the life of a Russian serf named Tito. He and other serfs were heavily abused by their masters, and they were forced to stay on the land with dozens of other serfs due to the feudal system still being present in Eastern Europe at this time. There would be a great number of serfs under one master because that's how wealth was shown, not in the amount of land someone owned, but in the number of souls they owned. But Tito and the others knew that didn't mean much to their master. They were at the whim of their master and had to keep supplying him with crops to sell to the Western Europeans. Failure to do so, or go against their master, could end in strict punishment, one of which being exiled to Siberia. Because they were only one serf out of the many that they already owned, they could easily be replaced, and their master enjoyed the right to punish their serfs.
One of the main outcomes of oppressing a large mass of people is a rebellion. A famous rebellion to come out of Russia was Pugachev's rebellion. This was when large quantities of peasants gathered behind Pugachev against Catherine the Great, who had favored nobles over the peasants, whereas Peter the Great favored peasants. This was one of the most powerful peasant revolts ever to come out of Russia. It shook the nobility, but they were defeated, sadly. However, this proved that the masses can sometimes challenge the aristocracy. Great place to be a peasant. England in the West was not much better.
We will now follow a Scottish peasant living in England named Adam. It took a long time until he had earned enough money to buy his own land. Living in Oxford was a horrible decision, since being Catholic in this city he had faced heavy discrimination from the Anglican residents. Using his job as a carpenter, after years he finally earned enough to buy his own land. However, he was only able to build a makeshift shaft because of his lack of funds after buying land. He needed money from somewhere, so he approached a noble. After much discussion, he got a loan and wished to start a livelihood. The interest was so high he couldn't escape debt, and there's nothing he could do to appeal since this lord had a foothold in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Their lifestyle was basically ruled by the lords/landlords. The lords desired more power, and they couldn't take a lot of power from the monarchs, so they took it from the peasants by basically controlling them. This basically made peasants unable to do much about it since they had to live their cruddy life in a cruddy way. The limits of their cruddy life was based off where they lived. As you travel from east to west, the life of peasants slowly became more like serfs until you get to Russia, where the life of serfs, or peasants, were as bad as it could get. For example, in the Western Europe, the jobs that peasants could vary, while in Russia you would have to be a grain farmer for the rest of your life.
Peasants would live in small hut villages in rural areas near a noble's castle. City peasants would live in slums trying to find jobs to make ends meet. No matter where they lived, peasants would be prosecuted and not have enough money to get by. If the peasant lived even more on the outskirts of society, they were accused of witchcraft. Anyone who was lower than a traditional peasant was at risk. Another common thing to have was strict laws that were really meant to limit the peasants. The game laws in England made it so the peasants couldn't hunt, therefore making it so only aristocrats were able to hunt. This meant that if peasants couldn't get enough food and had to resort to hunting for food, they were at risk of being put to death. In France, there were bantilles, which were dues that peasants had to pay their lords, or sauvages was forced labor for the lords that would be done by the peasants. So what does this mean for the everyday peasant? Did anything change for him? And the answer to that is not a lot. Things pretty much stayed the same for peasants. They had poor living conditions and did the same jobs over and over again for their lords, regardless of serfs or not. It could be very hard to be a peasant in this time, as you've seen in this presentation, but the grand scheme of things changed very little. They had little say in the government, as lords would often control both the House of Lords and the House of Commons. They had very little chance for social mobility. Things sucked to be a peasant. Thank you for watching our presentation.